So I'm going to get started on so please put the slides up. Yes. So I'm going to get started on the call for action. And I know you guys are almost hanging on because this is a wrap up and you have a lot of ideas right now. So I'm going to be talking about what constitutes as an inclusive internet, and particularly what kind of call for action should we be looking for, right? So inclusiveness is a really loaded term. I mean, let's face it, that we have a gut level reaction that inclusiveness is an innately good thing. But for us to have a healthier internet, you need to be a deeply exclusionary, right? So we need to scan for bad actors and exclude them for us to foster an inclusive internet, like spammers and hackers and the like. So what would be safer to say is that we need a much more to look at inclusion and more for interconnectedness of data, people, and things. And how do we go about doing that? Now, here's the question. What happens when we don't take that deeply interconnected approach and perspective to our problems at hand? What happens? I'd like to tell you a story, and for that, I would love to show you a slide, which I can't see. The one before. So I'm waiting for a slide, which I would like to show you. The next, yes. Okay. So what you see here are 14,000 live cats being parachuted into an island of Borneo, right, in Southeast Asia. Okay, this is not fiction. This actually happened, which, as you know, truth is stranger than fiction. And this happened in the 1950s, all right? So the World Health Organization was trying to help the Dayak people of Borneo to counter malaria, which was plaguing them at that time. So what did they do? They sprayed DDT, right, on the land, and very quickly it killed the mosquitoes. But very shortly after, it started to kill everything else. It really disrupted the ecological balance. So the insects died, the geckos, and the cats started to eat these insects and got poisoned and died. And what we had then was a proliferation of rats. And so they actually, the Dayak people, were faced with a bigger problem of typhus, and basically they had plague. So what did the World Health Organization do? They had to work with the British Air Forces to literally send 14,000 cats in there, right? Suspend the parachutes. Now, this sounds really crazy, but this is what happens when you think about problems in deeply, very simplistic and causal terms, right? So point A, point B, without looking at the bigger picture at hand. So next slide. So what we have here are wicked problems, right? It's basically a class of social system problems which are formulated where the information is confusing, where there are many clients and decision makers with conflicting values, and where the ramifications of whole systems are thoroughly confusing. Now, look, what are we facing today are really global, intrinsically global problems, and these are deeply wicked problems. For example, we are trying to reform, our healthcare institutions, right? I mean, look at that in terms of, particularly with the pandemic, we realize we're together in it as a whole, as a humanity, right? We're trying to do a Green Deal. We realize climate change cannot be boxed in. I can't have good air for the Netherlands. I can't have good air. I have to think in terms of a planetary level. And data governance and the reform of financial institutions, especially because of money laundering and the promise of blockchain, right? To possibly look at this in more global terms. So what we have are these astounding challenges. Yet what I find is that what's happening is the approaches are deeply local and sort of paying lip service to the globality of it and not much else. And that can be a very dangerous problem. So next slide. So here's the proposition that we are getting. We are getting something like the clean internet as a possible solution to our wicked problems, which are global in nature, which is the most ludicrous sort of proposition, because what this is basically doing is that the Americans are saying, you need to trust in us. basically the future of the internet is based on identity politics. Very Bush era like from the 90s is that are you with me or you're against me? And here are the good countries and here are the bad countries, rather than strive for standards along the lines of ethics and responsibility and sort of a climate change oriented Green Deal kind of vision, right? And this is really, confounding because the US has lost all moral legitimacy. Because if you're looking at evidence, right, in terms of the geopolitical wars going on between the US and China, then we find more evidence that the US has violated our global terms, from Snowden revelations to Cambridge Analytica. So technically, we should be having sanctions against the United States. So look, this idea of aligning the internet based on which countries and creating punitive sort of regulations based on your affiliation to certain nation states is an extremely constraining problem, which has already seen manifestations through the data localization. So what is promising is the next slide, is that the European Union is definitely being looked at as a much more promising potential global leadership as the Americans lose massive ground on a day by day level, right? I mean, sure, they're the richest country still in the world, but their legitimacy is very low. However, Europe, with their strong institutions, their commitment to really creating serious reform, taking on big tech, is tremendously commendable. I mean, GDPR itself is an astounding introduction because it allowed us to think not in market-oriented terms, but decenter the market and put people at the center, right? However, even with the European perspective, what I notice in terms of the new reports coming out in terms of the European approach to the future of AI, it's still very Eurocentric, which is basically more of a containment approach than a collaboration approach, right? And that is not going to allow for genuine leadership, because leadership in today's terms requires us to really be humble about what we have and what we can't do, and to seek for genuine collaborations with the rest of the planet to make this a sustainable future, right? So next slide. So what I'm trying to say here is, next slide. So, all right, so what I'm trying to say here is that what I notice is that there's still a very old sort of stereotype kind of perspective about the global south, which is majority of the world's population, right, outside the West. So typical European, where the policymakers or actors would then still see it in these sort of dichotomies that, well, if you're looking at an inclusive internet, we really look at it as these are beneficiaries out there in the global south that need our help, right? And during COVID times, we need to take care of our own. That's a sort of perspective. It's too high risk, or we don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the money. So that's one altruism model. The other is the opposite, is a fear-based binary, which is that look at the Uyghur camps, look at the China's firewall, the Chinese internet, right? And do we really want to take on that? No, we need to protect our citizens. So the fortress Europe model, right? But between these two sort of binaries lies the much of the reality of the global south today. And that is really missing, right? Next slide. So look, I am a digital anthropologist. I've spent more than a decade doing research on the ground in low-income communities from India to South Africa to Brazil, and a number of other countries, and engaged with scholars from around the world, companies. And I released my book last year on the next billion users. And since then, I have been engaging with tech companies, businesses, designers, tech designers from around the world in the global south particularly, and also the United States, right? And what I found is that there's tremendous interest, justifiably so, because guess what? They constitute the majority of the world's population and data producers. They are the future of the internet, right? Just in terms of how young they are, the number of them coming online, and they're disrupting what constitutes as, local versus global governance, right? So, yet what is really sad is that, I have been invited to a number of these tech companies, like, for example, Spotify and Google themselves just set up their next billion user lab last year and are very keen to engage, right? To understand these users. Because the idea is if you can make it in places like India and many parts of Africa, then you can make it across the board and you can create a much more vibrant, sustainable internet, which is more inclusive. And yet, what's bizarre is I've been in the Netherlands for about a decade, and I've been trying to engage with policymakers here and grant agencies, etc. And what I find is that I've been told time and again as well, right now we're focused on Dutch AI, as if it is containable. Yet the aspirations are to compete and come up with a competition, akin to that of Silicon Valley. And yet there's still this perception that this is not our thing. This is for other people, but we need to focus on Europe. There's something called European values. If you look at as if it's separate from a global value that people hold dear, right? This uniqueness, this exceptionalism needs to be dismantled, right? So next slide. So if we look at just user uptake, just India and China alone make up more users than the rest of the world. And we're talking of only 19 to 25% market capture. So we are talking about a much huge space where they can actually lead. Next slide. And yet there's a perception also with my engagement in Silicon Valley that they are very interested in the next billion users, but it's more about they will pioneer the AI for good, they will pioneer the right models, and then they'll disseminate it and trickle it down to the rest of the world. But that actually defies the evidence of what has happened in the last decade. If you look at battery life, it came from India because of extremely scarce resources and people and not having electricity. So the push towards extended battery life is really driven by the diaspora in Silicon Valley who happens to be Indian. Fintech is driven by China and has come up with astounding pioneering ways, which is fintech innovation was single-handedly in many ways responsible for bringing out millions of people out of poverty in less than a decade, unprecedented in global history, right? Which was allowing to give small micro loans to people who couldn't afford it through leapfrogging of the fact that they didn't have banking institutions. More than 2 billion at that time didn't have any banking experience. Or smart cities. Guess who's leading the way? Singapore, right? The fact is that many of these countries don't have the legacy infrastructures of Europe or the United States. And what they have to do is they have to pioneer completely out of the box thinking solutions so they can actually experience and not wait or waste multiple generations so they could enjoy what you and I have, right? Next slide. So look, it's not just about the data economy. You can look at innovation across different processes and sectors, and you can see the kinds of innovation happening, which is just take, for example, India, right? The prosthetic leg, the Jaipur leg, which is called the Jaipur foot, in the 1990s, in 2009, pioneered the cheapest prosthetic leg, which was for $45. Unlike the pricing of $12,500 in the United States. And this has made it far more inclusive in terms of allowing disabled people to have accessible medical care. Okay, if you look at the Arvind Eye Clinic, another global case study, which is extraordinarily impressive, which had 84 million cataract operations done by innovating in a humble way the sort of efficiency mechanisms of cataract surgeries, which allowed it to be extremely cheap, where 50% could even get it at cost almost, right? And yet it looked at the economy of scale. And then you can look at the data economy with Geo, which is another initiative in India, which made data astoundingly cheap. We're talking about 14 cents a GB versus 7 to 8 euros here versus $15 in the US. And this has allowed billions of people the chance to experience the internet, right? And this allows us to realize the data chain, the global data chain, which is intrinsically about not the Dutch internet, not the European internet, but a global internet where all these populations are shaping the very nature of it, right? Next. So I will even make a case for TikTok and Huawei at this point of xenophobia, where people are just shutting down when it comes to China. You can't say one nice thing about China without people thinking you are complicit or you are actually agreeing with the authoritarianism in China, and which basically allows us to shut ourselves and sort of box ourselves into a sort of mindset without paying heed to a couple of facts. China was the only country that was able to come up with an alternative to Silicon Valley and a global counterforce, right? It was a relatively, actually, a rather poor country, and it was considered a gone case because of its population problem. And that was a few decades ago. And they turned around and became a global superpower, right? Huawei, a business case, is a miracle, which is an inspiration, by the way, to many businesses around the global south, in spite of the media rhetoric in the West, because they looked at a back office small company that was doing the crappy jobs of Silicon Valley and turned it around and was able to become a global power and one of the biggest manufacturers in the world. And consumers were not buying it because they had a gun to their head. They were buying it because it was good, it was cheap, it was affordable. It allowed a lot more people to have smartphones. TikTok, they have pioneered new kinds of algorithm, which is about data minimalization. And if you look at their revelations about their algorithm, it is changing the game in terms of the sort of challenging big tech and also extremely promising for a number of startups that I've been talking to in the global south. So I want to wrap up by saying basically what my call for action is. Is next slide is look, I I love the fact that Europe is very ambitious in setting deep standards of ethics, responsibility, and also to see align itself with the Green Deal. However, we've got to understand that sticks don't inspire, right? Carrots do. And to be a global governor is very limiting in a time, and particularly in a global sort of setting where laws and regulations mean very little. Okay, it's all about enforcement. And with weak institutions, overburdened legal systems to non functional legal systems around the world, you're just going to have people pay lip service to GDPR and nothing else, right? So we need to see ourselves as global co creators, partner in really meaningful ways with the global south for us to come together to come up with the counterforce and stop thinking in European values and understand these are global universal values that people will take on for global flourishing. And if what we really need is not a watchdog to take a ruler to make sure people are abiding by the rules, of course that's important, but it's more than that. You need to create global alliances to inspire people to create alliance and stop looking at these divides as barriers and seeing them as things that need to be broken up so you can actually really reach out across, and create alliances which are really meaningful for the planetary prosperity. So with that, I would like to thank you, and I would love to see what reactions you have. So yeah, the ball's in your court.
Thank you very much, Payal, and I'm so pleased. I mean, you just lived up to all of my expectations, and I know the audience is also going to be like, oh, wow, you were like so passionate about what you were talking about, eager to get to the next slide. I saw this so many times, so thank you very much for being so vocal and
I
so
like having
animated.
control, I must say.
Ah, you're giving away too much about yourself. You like the control, okay. Hey, but Payal, it is a very hopeful message, and I see a lot of what you say as a kind of battle cry for the global south, really to feel empowered and to feel hopeful about and ambitious about their own, controlling their own destinies. But you talk about a lot about the need for this global alliance. But one of the images from the last 2 days that has really stayed with me was a picture that one of the speakers explained was drawn by children in, I don't know if it was Rwanda, but somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. And they were invited to draw the internet. And what they drew was a smartphone with logos: Facebook, Twitter, Google, Spotify. So Yeah, I find that quite scary. You know, I want to be optimistic, and we're talking about engaging people from all the different sectors to develop something that is just healthy and you know ethically strong and healthy. But it's not in these companies' interest to change all of that. So, should we actually be more pessimistic?
Look, pessimism is a privilege. I mean, nobody who is trying to create genuine change will be driven by pessimism because that creates inaction, right? It even creates cynicism. So, however confounding a problem is, however wicked the wicked problems are, you can only proceed in one way, and you have to be insanely optimistic. Just like entrepreneurs, right? They know they're given the odds of 9 out of 10 companies fail, but they're like, hey, I could be that one. It's like we gotta have that mentality because we are like artists. We are like we it's artists in a deepest of sense that you have something beautiful to create and you know it's out there. It's just a matter of time, and it's just a matter of really taking inspiration from everywhere and anywhere without looking at it through filters of fear, through filters of nationalism, through filters of like us versus them, which is what is happening right now. So what's the
How do you
alternative?
get
We don't
those?
have an
How do you get
alternative,
those
only
huge social
optimism.
media companies to really get on board with the message that we need to be more transparent? You need to welcome regulation. We need to think in the global interest, because that doesn't seem to be how they're acting right now.
Yeah, but that's the thing. It's like, yes, you continue with persisting in global regulation, reform, and also public pressure, because that's how things have changed, right? Look at the history of social movements. It is usually mass pressure, consistently over time that has yielded to change. Okay, but it's not sufficient, as I brought up, because Europeans and European policymakers need to understand that for oneself to really have a change, you need to have skin in the game. We need to have a European Silicon Valley. That's what I mean. And for them to actually have that, it doesn't mean that you have to come with it on your own. You create strategic collaborators because yeah, collaborations with people around the global south because they are full of ideas. They are in scarcity situations, so they do know how to optimize. They have to think out of the box. And in fact, if anything, we have seen evidence, as I've shown, that you can think out of the box with very little and do a lot. And I think there's a lot of mutual learning here.
Yeah, I definitely don't. I don't disagree, and I think that we all need to work towards a point where the best ideas are taken from people, no matter what their background is. But history does show us that the same sorts of people, the profiles have been the same over the last, maybe even centuries. So, what hope do we have that actually we're going to break that pattern of behavior and the pattern of personality who's really, been dominant?
Well, that's the thing. People are, I think it's very dangerous to once say that we can take ideas. We shouldn't be taking ideas because that's a very neo-colonial kind of perspective. It's more about us humbling that we are not just giving ideas, but we can get ideas so we become collaborators. So Europe has a lot to offer in terms of how to create stronger institutions, how to create a better lifestyle, like recalibrate what a good, vibrant, wholesome city is. And there's a lot to learn. On the other hand, you see how entrepreneurship is spiraling around. There's so much choice and competition in India alone, for example. They just need money. They need people investing in them. They need quality control based on collaboration, right? Which Europe can offer. And in terms of progress, look, people would love to say we've not made any progress, but of course we have. Just China itself is an astounding progress. I'm pretty sure anyone during the communist times will not say that, oh, gee, I don't see any progress, right? And it has brought millions out of poverty. People are very enthusiastic about Facebook in Bangladesh, for example, even though we make such a big deal out of it. Of course, it's problematic here, but Facebook is the Amazon where a lot of people, millions are coming online in Bangladesh, particularly during the pandemic, to sell their wares. And it is allowing them to make a livelihood. So we need to see these things in context. and not be so judgmental and moralistic and pessimistic that there's no progress, because of course we've made progress. The fact that we're having this conversation is progress, right?
Yep, fair enough. One of the points that you highlighted as another example of progress was GDPR, because it puts people more at the center of the decision-making process when it comes to enforcing their digital rights and so on. But to play devil's advocate, isn't it just a case that most people just click consent and move on? Just so, how much of a success is that?
So GDPR, what I do celebrate it as a sort of, it's the first comprehensive alternative to a market-oriented governance model, which was propositioned by the United States. However, GDPR is very flawed in many ways, but it's a work in progress. I have already critiqued consent, like, because consent without meaningful choice is absolutely meaningless. So it is actually more spamming than anything of any integrity. I find it also problematic to be individual centric, like put the onus on the user and look at it in terms of what kind of values do we want to instill in the in the framing, in the redesigning of the internet, in terms of applications, and going along with that, because a lot of users actually need to be constantly educated. It's not just about literacy, because the internet itself keeps changing. So it is too much pressure, and often they're not represented or they cannot be represented, particularly if you look at the gender issues across, which are pervasive in the global south, actually alongside even here. So there's a lot wrong and a lot problematic, but GDPR is constantly being worked on, and we already see that. And it's a good starting point for the kinds of perspectives we need to have. And I think that's something, like I said, is worth hoping for and working towards.
Yep. Yep, progress definitely worth celebrating. What do you see as the biggest threat to further progress before 2030, let's say?
Is hyper localization, is the like, and what's worse is hyper localization sold as the answer to these global wicked problems. Because I noticed, like, I just was walking around Amsterdam, Wester Park, and I saw a big poster saying "Go local." What the hell does that mean? It's like, so are we pretending that the global supply chain doesn't exist? I mean, the fact that we have e-waste, that we can actually have healthier countries in Europe because we dump a lot of our garbage in the global south, because we are constantly mining in Congo, so the conflict minerals, so we can have our cheap phones. We have content moderators in Philippines and Vietnam, so we can have a safe, clean internet. Let's not delude ourselves that we can go local, because what that is that I'm going to turn a blind eye to how my local is sustained by all this precarious labor out there, all these sort of like deeply violating human rights measures that we are taking without actually acknowledging it. So, yeah, I see that in data localization measures, where everybody's now doing their own thing, thinking that's the future of the internet. And these are extraordinarily dangerous times then.
Okay, so that's what you see as the biggest threat. What about, what are you most hopeful for here in Europe? You mentioned earlier that smart cities was something that was really driven by Singapore. Battery Life was an Indian, diaspora Indian project, if you like, and fintech Chinese. What are you hopeful about right here in Europe?
I'm hopeful that already Europe has so much to offer because it comes with so much diversity, right? And there's been a lot of talk that, oh, that's the weak point of Europe, because if only it was much more homogenous, it could create a Silicon Valley. But because there's so many different cultures, languages, it's almost looked at as a burden or an obstruction to a unified whole. But actually, on the other hand, it is a perfect microcosm of how the planetary futures can look like. We can actually see the way in which we negotiate. And, the fact that in Europe, we're not even debating for a second that, we should not have universal healthcare or a social security net. In fact, if anything, we're debating the other end, is how much of a safety net should we have? What kind of universal incomes should people have? So we're having a very different conversation. And I see Europe as a future and not the United States, where they're still basically a mix of deeply third world and first world countries where they're still talking about whether people need universal health care or the basics for human dignity. So I really hope that Europe takes that leadership position because it should never be the United States because it's going to be a long time before they resolve that polarization.
Yeah. So what does, if it was not Sir Tim Berners-Lee, let's say it's Payal Aurora's internet, what does that look like? What does your perfect image of the internet look like?
Well, I will definitely first thing do is not make it Payal Arora internet, and I'll put it under. Otherwise, that makes it private ownership, and that would be
Oh, you know what I mean. You know what I mean.
No, but although that's very tempting, by the way, I could retire tomorrow.
Exactly. Don't
So
pretend you're not tempted. No, but describe
exactly.
it to me. What does that future look like, 2030?
I really see us as, I really see a new kind of Silicon Valley because I see what's happening with the European Commission where they're pushing for financial reform, right? Particularly going after the whole money laundering. And this is actually a perfect opportunity where they see the role of AI as a way, blockchain and all these different technologies as a way to enable that, and which will push a nudge towards a real global collaboration. And I do believe that because there is that openness, there is that eagerness. And I just hope that we think beyond just global governorship and see it as, global creators. And I think then we have really nailed the game.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. And congratulations again on a successful summit.
Thank you on behalf of the NGI team.
Bye.